Emily was a beautiful girl with long, dark hair that flowed like silk down her back. Her deep green eyes sparkled with curiosity and intelligence, but tonight they were filled with terror. She never believed in the stories, vampires, monsters, things that go bump in the night. That was until she saw them. It all started when she moved into an old house on the edge of town. The villagers whispered about it being cursed, but Emily brushed off their concerns. She was a city girl, not one to fall for ghost stories. But from her first night in the house, strange things started happening. She would hear faint whispers at night, as if someone was in the room with her. Shadows moved across the walls, even when she was alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast an eerie glow over the landscape, Emily decided to go for a walk to clear her mind. The air was cool, the woods peaceful. But as she wandered deeper, she began to feel like she was being watched. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep walking. That's when she heard it, a soft rustling in the bushes behind her. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Standing there, just beyond the trees, were two men. At first glance, they looked human, tall, pale, and strangely beautiful. But as they stepped closer, she saw their eyes glowing a deep crimson in the fading light. Her blood ran cold. Without a second thought, Emily bolted. She sprinted through the woods, her feet barely touching the ground. Branches whipped against her face, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she could hear the men, no, the vampires, following her. Their footsteps were eerily light, as though they were floating. She didn't know how long she had been running, but her lungs burned, and her legs screamed for rest. The town was too far away, and she knew she wouldn't make it. In a desperate move, she veered off the path and stumbled into an old, abandoned church. Slamming the heavy wooden door behind her, she collapsed against it, gasping for breath. For a moment, all was silent. She listened, straining to hear any sign of the vampires. Then a soft knock on the door. "Emily," a voice whispered from the other side. It was melodic, almost hypnotic. "Let us in. We won't hurt you." Her heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She didn't know how they knew her name, but she knew better than to open that door. The knocking stopped, and everything fell eerily quiet. Emily's hands trembled as she slowly backed away from the door, praying it would hold. She glanced around the dimly lit church, hoping for some sign of safety. That's when she noticed the cross hanging on the wall above the altar, glowing faintly in the darkness. With newfound hope, Emily grabbed a fallen wooden plank, fashioning it into a makeshift weapon. She had read enough stories to know that vampires could be repelled by faith, even if her belief was shaky. Just as she stepped forward, the door splintered with a deafening crack. The vampires had broken through. One of them stepped inside, his lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing sharp, gleaming fangs. "There's no escape, Emily," he hissed. Her heart nearly stopped, but she gripped the wooden plank tighter and took a step toward the cross. As she did, the vampire flinched, hissing as the light from the cross seemed to burn his skin. Emily saw her chance. With a cry, she lunged forward, driving the wooden plank into his chest. The vampire shrieked, his body collapsing into ash before her eyes. The second vampire hesitated, then backed away into the night, his eyes burning with hatred. Breathing heavily, Emily dropped the plank and collapsed to her knees. She had survived, for now. But she knew that this was just the beginning. They would come for her again. And next time, she might not be so lucky. Emily didn't leave the church for hours. She sat in the corner, trembling, her eyes locked on the shattered door. The night felt endless, each sound outside sending her heart into a panicked frenzy. But eventually, dawn broke. Faint light streamed through the stained glass windows, offering a temporary sense of relief. The vampires wouldn't return during the day, that much she knew. But this wasn't over. They had found her, and she had no idea why. As soon as she was sure it was safe, Emily left the church. Her legs were weak, her body sore from the night's ordeal. The town felt eerily quiet, as though the world had been unaware of the terror lurking just beyond the trees. Emily knew she couldn't stay here. The villagers couldn't protect her, and she didn't want to drag anyone into this nightmare. She needed answers, and she needed to find a place where the vampires couldn't reach her. But where could she go? Her thoughts turned to an old legend she had heard long ago, about an ancient hunter who had dedicated his life to fighting creatures of the night. It was a distant memory, something she had once dismissed as another tall tale. But now, it seemed like her only hope. The hunter was said to live in the mountains, far from civilization, in a place so remote that few dared to venture there. If anyone knew how to defeat the vampires, it would be him. Emily decided that's where she would go. She had no other choice. The journey was grueling. Emily had gathered what little supplies she could from the town and set off toward the mountains. Days passed, each one feeling heavier than the last. She moved with haste during the daylight hours, but as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, she would find shelter, terrified of what might follow her. The further she traveled, the more distant the world seemed. The towns became smaller, the people more superstitious. When she asked about the hunter, some knew of him, but they spoke of him with fear, warning her to stay away. Others claimed he was long dead, that no one had seen him in years. Still, Emily pressed on. It wasn't until a week had passed that she finally saw the mountains rise before her. Towering, snow-capped peaks stretched toward the sky, their jagged edges looking almost like teeth. She had made it this far, but her strength was waning. As she climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew colder, and the wind howled through the trees like the whispers that had haunted her back home. She wrapped her cloak tighter around her and pushed forward, her body aching with every step. One evening, just as the sun began to set, Emily spotted a small cabin nestled in the valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the faint glow of a fire could be seen through the window. Her heart raced. This had to be it. The hunter's home. She approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching in the snow. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was truly the answer she sought. Before she could knock, the door swung open. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad, his face weathered and scarred. His eyes were a piercing blue, sharp and cold as the mountain air. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes told her he knew why she was there. "I need your help," Emily finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stared at her for a long moment before stepping aside, gesturing for her to enter. The warmth of the fire washed over her as she stepped inside the cabin, but it did little to soothe the fear that still gnawed at her heart. "I know why they're after you," the hunter said, his voice low and rough. He didn't look at her as he spoke, instead busying himself with stoking the fire. "You're not just a random target." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The hunter turned to her, his gaze intense. "You're part of something much bigger than you realize. The vampires aren't hunting you by chance. They want something that only you can give them." Emily shook her head, confusion washing over her. "I don't understand. I'm just a girl." "No," the hunter said, his voice firm. "You're the key to something they've been after for centuries, a power that can either destroy them or set them free." Her mind raced. Power? A key? None of this made any sense. She had lived an ordinary life until now. "Why me?" she whispered, feeling a knot of fear tighten in her chest. The hunter stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "Your bloodline. You're descended from a family that once controlled a great power. The vampires believe that through you, they can unlock that power and become unstoppable." Emily's head spun. She had no idea what he was talking about. Her family had always been normal, or so she thought. But now, everything felt like a lie. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. The hunter's gaze hardened. "You fight, but you can't do it alone. If you want to survive, you'll have to learn how to defend yourself, and you'll have to be willing to confront your past." Emily nodded, though fear still gripped her heart. She didn't know if she was ready for this, but she had no other choice. The vampires were coming, and if she didn't act, they would catch her. The days following her arrival at the hunter's cabin were grueling. Emily had never held a weapon in her life, let alone imagined fighting vampires. The hunter, whose name she finally learned was Marcus, was relentless in his training. He taught her how to fight with stakes, how to use silver knives, and how to move silently in the woods. But most importantly, he taught her to trust her instincts. Your strength isn't just physical, Marcus would remind her. They want your power because you don't know what you are yet. But once you understand it, they'll fear you as much as you fear them. At first, his words made no sense. Emily couldn't imagine herself as anything other than an ordinary girl, caught in a nightmare. But slowly, as the days passed, she began to feel something change. It wasn't just her body that was growing stronger. Something deeper inside her was awakening. One cold evening, after hours of grueling training, Emily sat by the fire, exhausted. Marcus sat across from her, sharpening a long silver blade. His face was as unreadable as ever, but Emily had grown to understand his quiet nature. He was a man of few words, and most of them were sharp, but she knew he was preparing her for something big. "Marcus," she began hesitantly, "you said I have power. What kind of power?" He looked up from the blade, his blue eyes flickering in the firelight. "Your family wasn't just normal. They were once guardians. Generations ago, your ancestors were entrusted with the power to protect the world from creatures like vampires. But as the centuries passed, the line faded. People stopped believing. The power remained dormant until you." Emily's heart raced. "But I don't feel any different. I've never done anything extraordinary." "You haven't had to," Marcus said, setting the blade aside. "But the vampires know who you are. They've been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. They think you're weak because you don't know how to use your power. That's why they want to get to you first, before you figure it out." Emily was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. The idea that she was part of something much larger than herself was overwhelming. She had spent her entire life feeling ordinary, and now she was being told that her bloodline held the key to stopping an ancient evil. "But how do I unlock it?" she finally asked, her voice soft. Marcus stood and walked to the window, staring out into the snow-covered mountains. "That's the question, isn't it?" He turned back to her, his expression serious. "The power is inside you, but it's tied to something deeper, your will to survive, your connection to your past. The only way to unlock it is to face what you fear most." Emily swallowed hard. She knew exactly what he meant. The vampires weren't just after her. They were after her fear. And to defeat them, she would have to confront the thing she had been running from. The first attack came at dusk. Emily had sensed it before Marcus did. A strange tingling at the back of her neck. A pressure in the air that made her heart race. She was outside, gathering firewood, when she saw the shadows moving through the trees. At first they were faint, barely noticeable, but then she saw them. Two figures, pale and fast, slipping between the trees like wraiths. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't panic. Marcus had taught her well. She dropped the firewood and sprinted back to the cabin, her footsteps light and silent on the snow. When she burst through the door, Marcus was already on his feet, a silver blade in his hand. "They're here!" she gasped, her heart pounding. Marcus nodded, his face grim. "Stay behind me." The two of them moved silently through the cabin, extinguishing the lights. Outside, the forest was eerily quiet. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she crouched by the window, her hand gripping the hilt of a silver knife. She could feel the vampires now, their presence like a dark cloud pressing down on her. Suddenly, there was a crash. The front door splintered inward, and two figures darted into the room. Emily's breath hitched as she recognized them. These were the same vampires who had chased her through the woods that fateful night. Marcus moved like lightning, his silver blade flashing in the dim light. He lunged at the first vampire, driving the blade into its chest. The creature shrieked, its body convulsing before crumbling into ash. But the second vampire was faster. It dodged Marcus's strike and lunged toward Emily, its crimson eyes burning with hunger. Time seemed to slow. Emily's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, she raised her knife. But before the vampire could reach her, something inside her snapped. A rush of energy flooded her body, and a blinding light exploded from her hands. The vampire screamed, recoiling as the light enveloped it. Emily watched in shock as the creature's skin began to burn, the light searing it from the inside out. Within moments it was gone, reduced to nothing but ash. The cabin was silent. Marcus stood frozen, staring at her with wide eyes. Emily's hands were still glowing faintly, the light slowly fading. She looked down at them, her heart racing, trying to understand what had just happened. "That," Marcus finally said, his voice low and filled with awe, "was your power." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emily felt something other than fear. She felt power. Real, undeniable power coursing through her veins. But along with it came a terrible realization. The vampires weren't just chasing her for what she could do. They were terrified of her. "Now you understand," Marcus said, stepping closer. "This is what they fear. This is why they want you. But this is also what will destroy them." Emily's mind raced. She had tapped into something she didn't fully understand, but the feeling was undeniable. The power was hers, and it had always been there, waiting for her to embrace it. But with that power came responsibility. She couldn't run anymore. The vampires would come again, and when they did, she would be ready. "I'm not running anymore," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "I'm going to fight." Marcus smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him since they had met. Good, because this was just the beginning.